Ready to go? Call the meeting in the order. I will take a roll call at this time. Mayor Pro Tem, are you here? Present. Okay. Councilman Rivenbark is chairing the Lower Cape Fear Water and Sewer Authority meeting. Councilmember Anderson, are you here?
Here.
Councilmember Barnett, are you here? Councilmember Spears, are you here?
Here.
Councilmember Waddell, are you here? And then the chair is here. So we'll begin the meeting. We have several presentations tomorrow evening. Consent agenda. C1 is approval of the minutes. C2 is a resolution establishing 2023 schedule of council's meetings. C3 is a resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into an interlocal agreement with the Cape Fear Public Utility Authority for security services, cost sharing in the 305 Chestnut Street building, and the budget impact, as you can see, is $17,827.44. PH1 is an ordinance amending the official zoning map of the city to rezone property containing 8.84 acres of land located at 2916 Market Street and 14 Wayne Drive from 009 Office and Institutional District and R15 Moderate Density Single Dwelling District to MD17 CD High Density Multi-Dwelling Residential Conditional District for a multi-dwelling residential development with 112 apartments and 36 townhomes, and this was continued from October 18th, 2022 meeting.
Mr. Mayor, we have been informed in writing by the applicant that they are going to withdraw this application.
Okay, very good. That'll make the meeting a little bit faster.
Yes, sir.
PH2 is an ordinance directing the housing inspector to vacate, close, and repair or demolish a dwelling at 805 South 3rd Street as unfit for human habitation pursuant to Article 5, Chapter 16 of the Wilmington City Code, and directing that a notice be placed thereon prohibiting its use or occupancy. And then ordinances. 01 is an ordinance amending the Land Development Code, Chapter 18, Article 5, Division 5 for various amendments to signage standards and to correct errors and inconsistencies found during implementation of the updated Land Development Code. 02 is an ordinance amending the Chapter 5, Article 7, Section 5-121 of the Wilmington City Code and Article F of the city's fee schedule to increase allowable towing fees and to clarify when city towing charges restrictions are applicable. 03 is an ordinance making a supplemental appropriation in the amount of $79,790 to the Riverfront Park project from reimbursable funds to be received from Live Nation Worldwide LLC for improvements at Live Oak Bank Pavilion at Riverfront Park. And then 04A is an ordinance authorizing supplemental appropriation of $883,609 in Community Development Block Grant Coronavirus CDBG-CV funds for permanent supportive housing rehabilitation and other homeless sheltering services and rehousing. And then 04B is a resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into a loan agreement with the Collective Impact in New Hanover County Incorporated, also known as Cape Fear Collective, for the rehabilitation of the existing permanent supportive housing development known as Driftwood, utilizing $698,593 of CDBG/CV funds.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir.
I just have a quick question on, this is probably clarification on 04A. There's some verbiage that says that the note would be forgiven at the end of the 20-year term and it'd be amortized over 20 years. Are we anticipating the note to have been paid in full at the end of that term, or are we anticipating there to be some shortage?
Let's let Suzanne Rogers come forward and just address that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Waddell. We are not anticipating any repayment of the loan. There's an affordability period for 20 years, which is
Gotcha.
what that refers
So
to.
then at the end of that 20, then.
Right, and after that 20, it will be forgiven. If for any reason it were not used for the purpose intended, then the note would be due.
Great, got it, thank you.
Thank you.
And I have one other question, not about the same, that I just missed on the presentations. The Clean Energy Advisory Committee annual report, I would just ask that if we could get a copy of that report in advance of tomorrow's meeting, just to review it.
Okay, next item is our resolutions. R1 is a resolution authorizing filing of condemnation actions for acquisition of full property takes for the Pine Grove Drive at Oleander Drive and McMillan Avenue intersection improvements project parcels 11, Gina DeChico, and others, and 34 Pope Properties on 17 LLC. And then R2 is a resolution authorizing city manager to enter into a contract with Hardesty and Hanover LLP in the amount of $200,000 for professional engineering services related to the compatibility of the rail realignment project and NCDOT's proposed replacement of the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge. And then reports is RP1, Council Appointments Committee for Boards and Commissions, and Councilmember Rivenbark, who's the chairman of that committee, will be giving us a report. So this concludes this pre-agenda. Are there any items to be brought forward, Mr. Manager?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. We've been in the process of doing a solid waste route study, and we'd like to present the results of that to you. In order to kick that off, we'd like to have Dave Mays come forward and introduce the topic, please.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. About 2 years ago, we went into an agreement with Raftellus, a firm that helped us first with a rate model that was presented as part of the previous year's budget recommendation. That was their first part of the work. The second part of their work has been looking at optimizing our routes and also doing an operations assessment for the way we operate. Jonathan Ingram will be presenting the results of that. With him also is Kevin Callan. He's the horsepower behind the route study. Following that, myself and Rick Porter will come back and discuss an opportunity that we have to try and modernize our service delivery for RTS. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Good morning, Council, Mayor, Council. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So as Dave mentioned, what I want to do today is really walk through some of the key findings relevant to a couple of specific areas of trash and refuse collection operations, and also hit some of the high points and the details and outcomes of the route assessment process. So just high level, what our project overview was, was really to look at 4 programs. There are kind of other things that the Trash and Recycling Division does, but there are really 4 kind of core collection programs that we focused on. Trash collection and disposal. This is what you all experience as the folks who pick up the refuse in your homes on a weekly basis. Right now, there are 9 semi-automated routes collected weekly. There are about 3 personnel per packer. So what that means is an average trash packer has a driver and typically 2 helpers who are responsible for grabbing the receptacles and putting them into a rear load packer. And we have some images. Rick and Dave will share some images to illustrate what that looks like a little later. As you know, 4 collection days per week, and that is kind of the core program for both single family and multifamily residences. In conjunction with that is recycling collection. There are currently 6 semi-automated routes. Now, what semi-automated means, again, is you have a driver as well as helpers who are manually loading recyclables into the containers or into the packers. Those are staffed with about 3 personnel. Our focus on the route assessment piece is really on this trash collection and recycling collection programs. You also have yard waste and bulky collection. So those are essentially weekly collection processes. In yard waste, it is collected on a weekly route, sort of similar to trash. Bulky is scheduled by appointment. So an individual who has large items that can't fit into a container, right, will call Recycling and Trash Services and schedule an appointment for collection. But there's also a biweekly roving bulky collection. So folks who set things out at the curb without calling. This is a particular issue for multifamily homes and rental cleanouts, those kind of things. The city has really focused on making sure that those don't become eyesores and that they be collected. And again, that's a biweekly program. And then, of course, there's downtown services. You all had a big event on Sunday, so I'm sure if you were down here, you have some sense of the kind of work that they put in. But they're handling litter removal, kind of keeping the area clean, as well as managing collection processes in downtown. We won't spend a lot of time specifically kind of talking about recommendations in this space, except as it relates to some of the routing areas sort of adjacent to your downtown service area. So in terms of the specific task that we were asked to complete, the first is the route assessment. So essentially, what happens is your individual packers are sent on routes, okay, to collect, and there's very specific pathways that they take through the city. We were asked to look at how those packers are deployed throughout the city and determine whether or not there's a more efficient way to go about the collection process, to either generate labor capacity to help you absorb some of the community growth, or just make some adjustments to improve some of the collection scenarios. So our process to do that was really very data-based and employee engagement-based. So we spent a lot of time engaging with folks who provide the service day in, day out, reviewing collection data, completing field assessments, so essentially going on ride-alongs and routes to make sure we understand sort of what the lived experience is in the field. And then the kind of final piece is selecting a specific scenario that you all want to implement and designing some route maps. And that is a piece that is yet to be collected, but we want to kind of bring you up to speed from here. We also completed an operations review, and we really looked at sort of recommendations in each of the areas of the city's collection processes. But what we want to focus on today are some opportunities and some specific policy-related recommendations and service-level recommendations relevant to yard waste and bulky collection. And again, similar process, heavy staff interviews, field assessments, as well as a lot of benchmarking and best practice review to inform what our recommendations look like. So I'll start with bulky service, and then we'll touch on yard waste, and then kind of get into the route assessment piece. So just an overview of the bulky collection process. Right now, the cost is included in residential collection, so there's no additional fee for an individual, a homeowner, or a business that schedules a bulky collection. Right now it's done by appointment once per week, as well as that roaming crew that I talked about. Acceptable materials are pretty broad, as long as it's not a hazardous material. So very, very often metal, furniture, electronic items, white goods, so refrigerators, those kind of things can often be included as well, couches, and there are no size limits or there are no amount limits on what can be placed out. There are a few challenges with respect to the current process. One is the collections are highly variable. So there's really no predictability on the amount that's going to be set out on a given day. You may have a collection that takes 10 minutes and it's real simple. You may have a collection that takes 3 hours because it's a rental cleanout, right? Or you may have a pile of construction debris that takes 3 to 4 hours and is kind of hazardous and potentially a safety issue. So there's some real unpredictability, and that makes it difficult to really predict what your staffing needs are and what your route needs are day in, day out. So there's some significant challenges there. There are also some safety issues. So, right now with bulky, this is not something that you can automate. So it's essentially, it's work that is sort of made for folks with a strong back. So you have folks who are manually lifting very heavy items into the packers, into the trucks, and this can create some challenges with respect to worker safety, and also generate some workers' compensation challenges, right? So, there's some issues there. There's also a fairness issue. So, as I mentioned, there's really no limits on collection frequency or value or volume. Most residences, if they use bulky, it's for a couch or it's for something you want to get rid of in your basement, right? It's relatively minor. But about 27% of the appointments that are scheduled for bulky collection are used by 3% of the population. So what you essentially have is there's a sort of a specific group or specific groups that are really highly utilizing the service for things like construction debris and especially for rental unit cleanouts. That's really what the main challenge is within Wilmington, and creates a number of issues. So in terms of benchmarking, we wanted to look at a few communities to see, how do they go about addressing some of these challenges, because these challenges are relatively common depending on in different communities. So we looked at specifically 9 communities in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And these were the same peers that were used as part of the cost of service assessment that was completed in 2021. So Dave mentioned the rate study that was completed, so we targeted the same communities there. So we looked at Asheville, Carolina Beach, Fayetteville, High Point, Jacksonville, Wrightsville Beach, Conway, Myrtle Beach, and Athens, Clarke County. And there are a couple of key takeaways from the benchmarking. One, about 5 of those benchmarks are offering appointment-based collection. And really, when we look at it from a best practice perspective, this is really the ideal. So we're not going to recommend any changes to the appointment-based process. Some are providing this weekly, about 4, but generally speaking, there is some wide variation, but generally some have limits, some don't, some charge fees, some don't. So there's a little bit of inconsistency. But really the best practice from our perspective is to create some limits on what can be placed out and to create a little bit of regularity and so that they can anticipate what the needs are from an operations perspective. Okay. So in terms of looking at our bulky recommendations, we really focused on a few areas. So again, we want to maintain that existing appointment level kind of process. That's really the most efficient. It maintains the current level of service for most of your residents and doesn't really represent much of a service change that folks are going to experience sort of dramatically day in, day out. But we do see a need to establish some size and scope limits for the amount of bulky that can be placed out. Right? So what we want to avoid is saying 5 or 10 or 15 cubic yards because no one really knows what cubic yards is. But we want to be very specific about what types of items are excluded from the collection, for example, construction debris, right? And we want to set up a process and set some limits around the number of items that could be placed out, the weight, for example, to make sure that the collection issues are managed and some of the safety issues are managed as well. We also see a need to potentially set up a fee and fine structure for some of these rental cleanouts. There are some challenges with respect to abuse to this process, and setting a fee structure as well as a fine structure that it is enforced through the code enforcement process will create a governor on that process to create a little bit more consistency on what that looks like. It will also hopefully compel the use of roll-off dumpsters for some of these major cleanouts, which is really the best practice in most communities. We also see, again, some impacts just in terms of setting those volume and item limits per collection day. Now, we will be talking about the automation process in a moment, and this will not affect any automation scenarios. Ultimately, bulky collection cannot be automated, so it can be implemented independent of any movement on the automation side. So with those changes, we would see a need to really focus on some code updates. So there would be some code updates and some changes with respect to ordinance. But we also see a need to really focus on some of the code enforcement, some of the customer education, public education processes, and potentially some need for additional code enforcement resources or sort of time that can be dedicated toward this, at least especially on the initial implementation period. That's not something we would say you add right now, but it's something to pay attention to as you would implement the program. We also see some opportunities on the collection side, on the yard waste side. So as you all may recall, there are limits to the amount of yard waste that can be set out. Right now there's 7 cubic yards, which if you imagine a kind of a small dumpster, that's about an 8 cubic yard amount, so it's about 6 by 6 by 6 if you imagine it as a cube. Right now, the collection process is done weekly. There are a couple of challenges. One, there is a pretty consistent use of plastic bags to containerize some of this yard waste. So contractor bags, Kroger grocery store bags, those kinds of things. Now, those cannot be composted, right? So one of the things that happens is whenever this yard waste is set out in plastic bags, the folks who are collecting that yard waste have to tear those bags open and empty whatever's containerized into the packer, into the truck. When we did our field assessments and identified the amount of time that takes, it increases the amount of collection time by about 4 times on average. So it turns a 2-minute collection process into a 10-minute. It turns a 2-hour process into a much longer process, right? So there's some impact there. We also see some pretty wide variation in yard waste volume and collection. Though there are limits, those limits haven't really been institutionalized in the minds of folks. So there needs to be some focus on education, some focus on enforcement, not from a punitive perspective, but to try to reach some compliance and try to set some limits around what that collection looks like. One of the main areas and main challenges are there tend to be some extreme volumes from landscaping companies. So when folks hire a landscaping company to come in, they cut down a tree, you'll have entire trees set out at the curb, and the assumption is that the city will pick it up. Now, even though that's not in the code, right, the city is going to pick that up because we don't want to, because the city is focused on customer service, focused on making sure that the community looks attractive, so they will collect that. So there needs to be some work around really setting and enforcing those limits around collection, because one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later, the city spends an inordinate amount of time on yard waste collection. It's one of the highest impact areas from a labor perspective, and some additional focus there is warranted. So we really see two options, and the first is, eliminating the use of plastic bags. So by essentially saying, no more non-compostable materials from a container perspective. It'll save some time during the collection process, and it's minimally impactful, right? So everybody knows the craft paper bags; those are completely acceptable from a yard waste and composting perspective. But this doesn't really address some of the larger scale disposal issues that we'll talk about. But we also see a need, another option is to require that yard waste be containerized. So rather than kind of piles sort of strewn about the parkway, setting it up so that the craft paper bags or sort of rubber containers, so similar to what you would use for your trash, are used for recycling. And that'll create some consistency around service and make it a lot easier to manage from a safety perspective and from a physical labor perspective. So really kind of looking at what the best options are, we really see the opportunity to implement both options. It would have relatively minimal impact to the community and could address some of the operations challenges that we see. So with that, I will pause before we move into the route assessment and ask if there are any questions on those two subject areas.
I have a question. Can you hear me? So what initiated this assessment? What initiated this study?
So what initiated the study was back in 2021, there was a need to develop a rate model, and as you all may recall, the city came to you with a proposed rate structure. As part of that approach, the city also said, okay, if we're going to look at developing a rate model, we also want to make sure that we're operating as efficiently, as effectively as possible. So this is really an opportunity to not just focus on the revenue side, but to look at operations and efficiency from a day-to-day perspective as a way to improve operations, improve service to the community, sort of enhance that important role, but to also control any potential increases in expenses.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Neil?
Do our, this may be better answered by Dave, but it sounds like you've gotten pretty close to it. Do our bulky pickup trucks have lift gates?
Do they have lift gates? Some have lift gates, yes.
Some.
Yeah, I will ask Dave or Rick to validate that. I can't answer whether they all do. Oh, there's Dave.
We have a variety of different trucks used for bulky. Some appointments are handled with the regular packers. If you're collecting a couch, for instance, that would probably be loaded in a packer truck. But we do metal and electronics using a flatbed that does have a lift gate on the back.
So you schedule it based on the item?
Right. The appointment is very important. Our administrative staff that receive the phone call try to get as much information from the customer as
So if
possible.
it's a refrigerator or something, you
Right.
send the lift gate guy. I mean, you talk about what insurance issues and people getting hurt, and I'm just trying to think through that. I mean, so that's because there was a time, and I haven't done it in a while, but where you'd come down here and you'd buy these stickers. Do we still do that?
We do, and that is for extra trash. That's for
Right,
an extra bag that you may not be able to fit into your cart. You can just set it beside the cart, and we'll pick that up if you put a sticker on it. But that's a separate issue from bulky.
Okay. I swear, I mean, I kind of use those also, not really for big bulky stuff, but stuff that's just odd shaped. You know, like, I don't know, it won't quite fit in that. it's not a refrigerator, but, you know, I don't know, a 5-foot board or,
Sure.
you know, or something. So I was just trying to, all right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Barnett?
You. You gave a statistic that said 3% of the stuff that you pick up.
3% of scheduled appointments come from, or 27% of scheduled appointments come from 3% of the city.
Okay,
3%
so
of
it's
the
mostly
user base.
construction work and stuff like
Tends to
that?
be construction, rental cleanouts, those kind of things, or the heavy users. You know, most residences use it maybe once or twice a month, right, or a year, I'm sorry.
Will your study, and maybe coming up later, will it give us some idea of, like, for example, when I ride around the city, there are certain neighborhoods that it seems like the bulky stuff stays on the ground a lot longer than other neighborhoods. Did you find anything like that?
So there are a couple of ways that those bulky items that aren't scheduled, right, are handled. One is if someone in a packer who's doing their normal collection route will call in and identify that there's an area that the roving bulky needs to address. The roving bulky group is really designed to kind of drive through various parts of the city to identify any problem areas and get them scheduled and on the list. So it may be you know, depending on, I can't speak to the specific examples, right? But it could be there's a backlog of collection, right? It could be they don't know about it yet. You know, one of the things that we really want to focus on is limiting and creating some consistency around what's set out on the appointment based, and setting some restrictions on what can be set out ad hoc.
All right, thank you.
Isn't it fair to say that a lot of times that's somebody doesn't call it in? I mean, so, I mean, they
That's
just dump,
exactly it.
people move out, they dump it and don't call. So, because in a lot of cases, the tenant, you got a tenant, renter situation and who's going to pay for it. And the renter just puts it out there and runs and figure the landlord pays for it. I mean, I'm hoping you're going to give us a little, how we handle that situation.
Yeah, so unfortunately, there's really no way to, you know, to decide, okay, who ultimately gets billed to the property, right, to the property owner. And ultimately, that's going to get passed through. We all know that, right? From a landlord perspective, sometimes it's a renter setting items out. Sometimes it's just a normal move out. Very often, it's an eviction where the property is being cleared. It's really difficult to determine, all right, what's the specific circumstance related to this particular item, right? But the way in which to create some consistency is to focus on the property owner.
Mr. Waddell?
I'm sure you've recommended augmentations to other bulky programs in various municipalities because it seems like low-hanging fruit, both from a revenue generation standpoint and a efficiency standpoint. I'm just wondering if in some of these other municipalities that you may have implemented some of these bulky strategies, have you seen like an adverse effect in the community where people are just leaving stuff out longer, not calling maybe because I just don't want it to, you know, start to trash up the community? Yeah,
one of the things that we really want to be careful with, and partly the reason why we didn't necessarily recommend that you add a fee structure onto bulky collection in general, is we don't want to incentivize illegal dumping, right? That's one of the things we really want to be careful with. And that is something that a lot of communities really want to intentionally manage against. So that we want to avoid that whenever possible.
Sure. And then a little follow-up to, you said, you know, a lot of, it'll tie to the property owner, whatever there is a fee structure, you know, established for the bulky pickups. I would just say whenever that is implemented, I own a property management company. It would be passed through typically to the tenant, but that security deposit window per state law is like 30 days. So it's really quick. So our staff would need to make sure that if there is a fee implemented, so if you're going to actually charge it to a tenant who left everything out, that has to be done in a timely manner. So
Understood.
That's important to consider in the process.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, one of the things I didn't speak to a lot was the need for a pretty significant public education period, right? Just in terms of engagement with property owners, making sure that there's clarity when there is an infraction, so to speak. The first step is not to fine someone, right? It's to, ultimately, we're trying to get compliance and bring everyone to the same level. So,
Well, thank you. Looks like, I mean, it's a great presentation.
Mr. Barnett?
Yeah, you just mentioned build. And when I was hearing you, I thought you mentioned that, like, for example, if I was cleaning up my house, I could just put the stuff on the street. If I call it in, they'll pick it up, right? Now, we're not billed or anything, right? Because it's already included.
That's correct.
All right, and even like for a renter, if he evicts somebody and he puts it on the street, if he calls it in, somebody has to pick it up. The city picks it up, and there's no bill or anything, correct?
That's correct. If they called and scheduled it, there would be some limits to the amount that would be set out, though. That's an important distinction, right? So we want to make sure that it's reasonable in a given day to address and still be able to hit all the other appointments scheduled during that day, right? One of the challenges that happens is, you know, if we have someone puts items out and sometimes it can take 2-3 hours to clean it up. And that delays any implication or any collection in other areas. Can move into overtime space. It can move into a deferral of when those next appointments get picked up, so it sits out longer than you might like it to, right? So there are a lot of impacts to having unanticipated sort of heavy workload periods in the middle of a collection day.
Okay, thank you.
So are recommendations coming later in this presentation?
So in terms of recommendations specific to bulky and yard waste, I did kind of hit those, but the recommendations on the bulky side are size and scope limits, define what you can set out and the amount that you can set out by appointment, okay?
That's as detailed as you're going to go with your recommendation?
I'm sorry?
That's as much detail as you're going to provide with that recommendation? I mean, how much? You know, what are, okay, an hour, or how do we determine what's too overburdensome?
In terms of the
Bulky,
amount?
yeah.
In terms of the
What
amount
you
that can be
just
set
talked
out?
about,
Yeah.
tenant kind of situation, those sidewalks from here down to there,
Yeah.
at what point are they kind of over leveraging the system to where we need to recoup funds?
So the average resident, right, it's going to be an item or two, right? So we're going to set it up, so you would set it up so that the limits are usually one large bulky item per appointment, or two. I mean, I think there's some flexibility in terms of what that service level looks like. And before that would be finalized, it would be brought to you in terms of the specifics, right?
But over and above that is,
Schedule another appointment next week.
but it's
Right.
already all out there. So, that's not how that works.
Yeah.
So, you're going to say, when somebody moves out, they move out, they're gone. See you later. Stuff's all up and down. So, that's the biggest issue I see with it. So I'm asking you, your recommendation to resolve that. So,
The recommendation to resolve that is to define basically a standard bill amount, a standard amount for the city collecting that. So we wouldn't want to leave that there until a multifamily property owner called and scheduled it, right? What you would do is you would essentially identify an amount for collection. This is our set fee for collecting this amount, and then ultimately that gets billed to the property owner.
So
Now,
you
one
got
of
a
the
free,
challenges-
so you're saying free for keep it the way it is for a couple pieces. If it's more than two pieces,
2 pieces, yeah. We can say that for
Then
discussion
then
purposes, but
it's
it'll be specifically defined a
$50
little later.
or, so you're saying that's just down the road. Y'all aren't ready to make that?
Well, in terms of defining what the structure looks like, free for, the single appointment base, so a standard sort of put out, so that's limited to an individual item or 2 individual items, a couch and a chair because you're moving out, that kind of thing. So setting your size and scope limits, and for a rental property or multifamily owner, they can meet that as well, right? So if you have a lot that needs to be disposed of, it needs to be done over a few weeks, essentially, right? If you're an individual homeowner. Now, if you own a rental property and you set the items out there, the city is going to collect that because the city is committed to making sure that there aren't sort of lingering piles of debris sort of scattered about the community, right? But there would be an amount that would be charged for that and then billed to that property owner if it's in excess.
Got it.
After some significant education and options, and it wouldn't be an initial charge.
I understand that, but your point here is some people are overburdening the system. And when they do that, they ought to try to help us carry some of that burden.
It
is
needs
that
to
not?
be disincentivized, yes.
I'm curious as to how you're going to know whether it's a rental or not. But, obviously some places are,
Yeah.
but then like in my old neighborhood, there are houses that are rented. They look like they're owner occupied. How are you going to know? And I moved out of a 3,500 square foot house into a condo a couple of years ago. I put tons of stuff out on the alley and called every week, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, so in some cases it's going to be obvious, in many cases it's not, right?
Right.
You're
Right.
absolutely right. And there are always going to be some challenges in terms of identification. One of the things that often happens is there are items that have an address on it, so that's part of it, to try to pin it to a specific address. If you know that it's a rental unit, it would sort of tie into that program, but I think the city would err on the side of not overburdening particular areas.
Even if it's a rental, the property owner is paying, so why are we discriminating against renters? But
I think it's going to be, I was saying, anything that happens, if there's going to be a bill, it's going to be tied to the property owner. And then the property owner would be the burden on the property owner to carry it through to a tenant.
well,
But it doesn't have
why
to be.
can't that property owner put something out
Ms. Haynes,
for pickup?
if I could, I think Jonathan was using the term rental cleanout more generically than perhaps was accurate.
Okay.
It's really a volume-based. If you're going to clean out your house, whether you own it or you're renting it, it's about how much you put out. And if you're going to put out an amount that exceeds a reasonable amount, then it's going to set you up for the rate structure that Jonathan was mentioning.
Okay, so it's not really whether you're a renter or whether you're an owner.
It's a circumstance.
It's really how much is out there, how organized it is. I mean, we see this where on Oleander or on Dawson or Worcester, we see this a lot, that stuff's just thrown out there, just piles and piles of stuff. So it's really not about a renter because, somebody owns that property and they're already paying fees.
Correct.
So we're not going to discriminate on whether you're a renter or not. It's how much junk you put out there.
That's fair. I apologize for the miscommunication. So the primary challenge is in rental units, right? But it applies more universally.
Great.
Can I expound on what Margaret is saying? Because the trash collection or bulky item collection is more so tied into the water bill. So not who owns the property, right? So there's no way to differentiate between who's the owner and who's the renter. I think our only concern is there an active water account, and that's how the collection is made, right?
That's correct. And if it's a rental, there'll typically be a master account unless unless the landlord is footing the bill for the utility. So there can be
because not many landlords will put utilities in their name.
not too many.
Right.
Okay.
Any other
Thank you.
questions or concerns? Okay, great.
Okay, thank you all very much. So we'll jump into the route assessment piece. So just quickly, I'll hit on the approach. So there's really a few things that we want to cover with you today. First is sort of what we were tasked with and what our specific approach is for developing the route scenarios. So the first was to develop a baseline model. So essentially what that means is we did some exhaustive study of the current process. So what are your metrics? What are the times and weights of your current refuse, recycling, yard waste routes? What are your current service levels, your parameters? What's driving workload? What's impacting the ability to execute these routes? So really kind of an extensive study of the way things currently are. And we developed some key performance indicators. So, how do your current service outcomes in terms of trash collection, recycling collection, compare to best practice ranges for efficiency? And then we looked at really two scenarios. So, evaluating route scenarios on the trash side. The first is, what could we do to optimize the current semi-automated routes with very few or minimal No, really, collection day changes. So what can we do to make this process a bit more efficient without impacting customers in a way so that their collection day changes? So that's kind of the first scenario that we looked at. The second was, what are the opportunities to convert to automated routes? So both without collection days and with collection day changes. So if we wanted to move to automation, one, is it even feasible in this community? You know, you have a lot of alleys, right? You have areas with, you know, a lot of on-street parking. So what are the real opportunities to automate? Is it even feasible? And then what's ultimately the impact on the customer from a collection day change perspective? So if we had to redesign the routes to accommodate automation, and you would have to, we'll kind of get into some details there, you know, what's that impact on the customers? So at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kevin Cowan, to talk about
Before you leave, could you define automation?
Absolutely. So, semi-automated, which is your current process, where you have a driver and you have a rear load packer, and we'll show kind of a video and an image of what this looks like at the end here. But you have a driver, and then you have two helpers who will get out, pull the actual trash receptacles to the truck, and load them into the rear of the packer. Automated has one driver, and that receptacle, the trash packer, has an arm that will reach out and collect and hook onto the trash can and tip it into the top. So it only requires operation from one. So it's a rear loader
loads from the side rather than the back.
That's correct. It's a side loader. Yeah. So you know there are a couple of issues with that, and I'll talk about that especially when we get into the safety issue, but some of the safety conversations. But there's some real advantages going to automation from an efficiency perspective and from a safety perspective.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, Kevin.
Good morning. So we did a baseline assessment, and we looked at your current trash, yard waste, and recycling, and then compared them to numbers that we would see in other municipalities throughout the years. One thing I wanted to point out is I actually worked on your routes in 2010, so there's some historical knowledge of the Wilmington waste collection. So the trash, in general, they average about 8.5 hours to complete. That's not bad. You don't want trash routes that take 10 hours because they vary. You have seasonal variances. You usually want them to be about max 9.5 hours in a 10-hour day. Even 9 hours is fine, and you're at 8.5. So the routes are not really light by any means, and if you look at the stop counts, they're pretty heavy. But what is revealing of excess capacity is you don't pack out the trucks. So you're doing an average of 1.2 dumps a day. That means you pack out, go dump, and then 20% of the time you have a second dump. So the biggest thing with the trash truck to maximize capacity is you maximize the dumps. That's your limiting factor. So the best we can do with a trash route in 10 hours is get 2 full dumps or 3 full dumps. So you have a mixed environment here a lot. You have these downtown areas, which are a lot slower. They're semi-automated collection. We need helpers on the back to get the trash into the truck. So you have a mixed bag here. But in general, if we look at your trash collection versus other municipalities, it's not inefficient by any means. The routes are not bad, but there is some opportunity. Yard waste is a different story. Yard waste isn't typical what we would see. Typically, yard waste takes less time than trash collection. But here, yard waste takes more time than trash collection. So trash was averaging 8.5 hours. Yard waste is averaging 9 hours. And they run the exact same routes. That also provides potentially some opportunity to have seasonal routes, run a different number of routes in the winter than the summertime, but you don't have a massive amount of variance here. The range, the route balance. So one of the factors of efficiency for yard or trash collection is you want all the routes to be even. If everybody has an even route, there's no easy routes and hard routes, everybody comes in at about the same time. So if you have these hard routes, these easy routes end up magically taking 9 hours instead of 7 hours. So there's a lot of variance that indicates a need to balance out the routes. But in general, the amount of material you collect, only doing about one dump a day in 9 hours is very exorbitant. It's a very exceptional service. Normally, we would see yard waste taking less time than trash collection. The recycling is similar to trash. They're not maxing out well, you only have one dump for trash, so maximizing the dumps, you won't really get more than one dump a day in trash in your area. The average time is about 8.4 hours. That's about the same as trash. And the range is very significant, 7.2 to 9.6 hours. So some routes get done in 7.2, other ones are taking 9.6. That indicates the need to balance out the routes, but there isn't a big opportunity to run less trucks for recycling. You run 3 trucks now, and it's every other week. It's really hard to go down from 3 to 2. Your service area, the number of customers you have, limits the ability to optimize the recycling. The best we can do is balance them out, have everybody with an even amount of work every day. Was there any questions about those KPIs? Mr. One-All?
On the trash KPIs, the pack-out ratio, so does that mean that we're getting the truck about half full and then taking it to the dump?
On average, so they do 1.2 dumps.
Okay.
So that second dump is the one that's usually partial.
half.
Or very limited, less than half. There's probably one full dump and one quarter dump. Any other questions?
I will say that downtown is sort of a different scenario there, because the smaller packers come through a number of times a day, and there's just one driver and the guy jumps out and he picks up the cardboard, or there's another truck that comes with one guy and he jumps out and he picks up this blue bag program we have. So that's a whole different sort of operation.
It
and
is.
They come through there a lot.
It's daily, right? The CBD collection is...
It's more than daily. I mean, they come through there once or,
'cause
two
there's
or
multiple
3
services.
times a day, I think.
Yeah,
I
that
don't
service, we're not looking at changing the CBD service.
They come through 3 times a day. I mean, they keep it moving downtown, and these guys are hustling.
And the downtown looks great. It's clean. They're doing their job. We weren't looking at that. We're looking at all the residential collection. So that downtown area, which I'll show you,
Okay, you just mentioned the CBD, though, and so that's downtown.
Well, let me show you the map. Or let me get to the map and I'll show you that section, Ms. Haynes. Okay, so we modeled these 2 scenarios. The first was just, let's look at your current routes, not change anything. Can we optimize? And as you saw, there was a little bit of capacity in there. We could probably get down to 8 routes, but it doesn't make sense. You've been running 9 routes for now. You need operational capacity to absorb growth. And that has been happening over the years. You've been absorbing growth. So we don't really see a need for changing the current system. You could balance the routes, balance out the routes, but reducing the number of routes would limit you in the future. You'd probably have to add it back. The second scenario is looking at automation. So we looked at the ability to run an automated collection. This is a side load vehicle with one driver, no helpers. They control the arm, it goes out and picks up the plastic container, versus what they're doing now with 2 helpers on the back. Sometimes they don't have 2, just 1. So the drivers and the crews, we got them all together, and they came up with 77% of the customers could be automated. We also did our own assessment, and we came up with 88%. Interestingly, last year, the same time we did this, we did the exact same study in Atlanta and Roanoke, and the numbers were almost the same. The drivers came up with like 3/4, and the consultants came up with like 85, 90%. The reality is, it will become that 85, 90%. The crews are worried when they go to automation. It's a new truck, it's an expensive truck. They have to learn how to use the stick while they're driving. It's daunting, so they're intimidated. But what happens is they all realize it's so much easier and they want more to go into automation because nobody wants to be out there slinging trash. So there's an evolution that will happen, and that will go from that 77% up to 85% or so. So anyways, we looked at automating 77%, and the issue here is we can't automate without changing the collection days because the majority of your semi-automated collection is in the old town, and I'll show you that on a map here. There's pockets of suburban developments that also require semi-automated, but the majority of it's just downtown. So if we don't change the collection days, we would need 4 automated trucks on Monday and 7 on the other days. So it doesn't make sense. You can't have a mixed fleet like that. It's not maintainable. So we looked at, if we change the collection days, and I'll show you a map here in a second, this would come out to needing 7 or 8 routes. 8 routes initially, six automated and 2 semi-automated. But as I said, there's going to be an evolution on 3 fronts. You have to have the customers have these carts. They've had the carts for a long time. They're used to putting them anywhere. When you have automated, they need to put them with the front facing out and not behind a car or something. So there's some training of the customers. They have to learn, oh, I have to actually put the cart like this. That takes a couple months. It's training of the drivers. They also have to learn how to run an automated truck. That takes a few months, but they will get good at it. And the customers, there's some impact in the beginning, and then they get accustomed to it. It's just garbage collection. And then the third is this evolution where the crews will start to move semi-automated customers into automated. And all of that's going to happen over the first year. And after that, I think it's totally feasible. You'll get down to 6 automated and 1 semi-automated. But to start that way would be not practical. It'd be easier to start with more routes and then evolve with the customers and the crew's capability. Was there any questions about that section?
Neil?
I've had a little experience with the automated, and I wonder if you factor in, and this, it's a little anecdotal, but it's been in more than one city. So do y'all, with the actual trash cans, they don't last as long. It's just, I don't know, y'all may argue, if so, I think you're in cahoots with the trash can people, because the tops, whether they use a squeeze or whether you use the ones that grab the handle's broken, the tops are off, trash blowing everywhere. That there's a cost there too, because in my opinion, we don't want that kind of trash can out on the streets. So I hope you're plugging in that number for replacing the carts more often.
That's interesting. I've never heard that. I don't doubt it at all, but I haven't heard that issue that the versus semi-automated collection, the carts would get ravaged more. But
it's just an inaccurate, the grab is just different, and the squeeze, I don't know which kind you promote, but I've seen squeeze, where it just squeezes the whole can, and I've seen it where it grabs that rail across the,
it depends
front,
on the setup,
which is a much more precise. I see more.
Semi-automated
I see more just the squeeze, and that squeeze, how tight it is, how loose it is, how much garbage is in it, the tops get popped off. I don't know. It drives me crazy because there's just stuff flowing out of the top, blowing out. When you drive through parts of Charleston, and it's awful. So, just a thought.
Yeah, there's wind factors too. That's something we can look at. I can't say that I have. Yeah, it could be increased maintenance, I assume.
You good?
Okay, so the customer impact. If you look in your current Monday, so the gray, these are customers that the crews identified as have to remain semi-automated. all the gray areas. So you can see all the grays in Monday, which requires us, unfortunately, to change the collection days. If you look at the new days, you can see Monday, that Old Town area is divided down into 3 days. So Monday becomes all across the top, basically your whole northern area. Thursday's the western part, Friday's the middle, and Tuesday is the east. This ends up impacting 55% of the customers would have a collection day change. It's about 18,000 carts, about 16,000 locations. Please.
The current collection days over the collection day changes, the change from 32,000 change carts to 18,000 gross carts, what is that? What is the gross cart count?
That's 55% of the 32,000
So that's like 18,000 carts that are being affected rather than the 32,000 because there's some reduction and duplication of efforts.
Well, you have about 30,000 total
delta.
customers, 33,000 carts. I'm sorry.
The point of what Kevin's making is that 18,000 customers are going to have to change from Monday to Tuesday or Tuesday to Thursday or something like that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, Jonathan.
So that kind of gives you a sense of what the customer impact is just in terms of collection day. But there are other considerations outside of route efficiency that we want to take into account and share with you. So the first is workers' compensation claims. So one of the main benefits of automation is it really decreases the amount of workers' compensation claims that you have. It makes it a much less labor-intensive job to collect trash. Just an example from Greenville, North Carolina, in year one, they had about $190,000 savings in workers' comp claims when they implemented automation. Now, one of the challenges here is the city relies upon temporary labor, so to support many of the routes. So will you hit 190,000 or something comparable? That's something we wouldn't make an assumption in terms of what the savings would be, but you would definitely realize some savings, okay? The other piece is you'll see a lower risk of traffic-related injury. One of the challenges is when you have folks in a semi-automated route, your helpers are crossing the street quite a bit, right? So to collect receptacles, bring them over because it's a more efficient process on the semi-automated size. One thing you will see is likely a little bit of an increase in property damage, especially early on, mailboxes getting hit with the arms, those kind of things, and you have to really intentionally manage that and be responsive when an issue like that happens, right? We also see a real value of moving to automation really increases the pool of potential employees that you recruit from this work. So, a strong back now is not the only requirement. So it really broadens the applicant pool, and, as you all are probably aware, there are a lot of recruitment challenges in local government, and there are a lot of challenges in the refuse collection space as well. This allows you to tap into some demographics that maybe hadn't been considered before.
What would be the difference, the reduction in personnel?
In terms of cost savings?
No, in terms of number of people that have jobs.
So we would focus initially, and we'll kind of touch a little bit on the impact of this a little bit later. Rick and Dave Mays will come up and speak to that. But we see it primarily hitting the temporary pool labor and not really a reduction in terms of full-time. So it'd be decreasing about 9 FTE, full-time equivalent employees worth of temporary labor hours. So not people, but driving down your temporary labor cost. Which means you don't have a benefit savings. It's essentially a non-personnel savings. Kind of it's an accounting thing.
So you're doing away with the guys that run to get the trash cans. Sure. So here's the other thing, and I don't know. These are for my children renting places, and every time I show up there, I'm like, that do the automated. in semi-urban environments or urban environments, it means in those cities to really be able to pick it up, you have to put it in the street. I mean, if it's up in the sidewalk, you got people bicycling, you got walkers, you got these things are in the road, and sometimes people don't get them for days. So it's a little bit. Do you find that? I mean, I see that heck at Wrightsville Beach even. I mean, you're trying to wedge it between two cars, and then somebody else parks there a little later, and then there's some issues there that I see on my children's rentals.
I'll just throw in, I'm sorry.
And that's where you get your car damage. The guy tries to grab it anyway, and it's a little tight or whatever. I'm not against it. I'm just I'm curious how you remedy that, because I just don't see any way around it.
All those areas that are, all those areas that are difficult to collect, all the gray that we showed, it's going to be the old collection method with the helpers. So the automation really is effective when you can get a roll going and you don't have anything interrupting you. That's when you can get the 1,200 count stops. So you need to have easy collection areas.
And that's really why Old Town, for example, a lot of on-street parking, it's not a very conducive area for automation, so it's remained semi-automated. So in answer also to the temporary labor question, we wouldn't be fully eliminating temporary labor. You're still going to have semi-automated routes, right? And also roles for yard waste and bulky collection, but it does kind of reduces your reliance on temporary labor a little bit, which is positive.
So it seems like if we were to implement all this automation, that your position is that we would have a significant amount of savings over the long haul, right? Because we're reducing some FTE, non-duplication of efforts. Would that result in, or has it in other municipalities, that result in some reduction of rates to the end user?
So that's a little bit of a complicated question, and I will defer a little bit on some of the specific cost implications to Mr. Mays and Mr. Porter's discussion. But here are kind of the big takeaways. You will achieve efficiencies in the operation, requiring fewer labor hours to collect the same amount of refuse, right? Does that necessarily mean it will very likely reduce the amount of rate increases that you will need, but it won't eliminate the need to have rate increases down the road, right, as costs grow. But one of the things that it does do is it allows you to absorb growth within your current framework. So as the community continues to grow, as you have more as you have a changing dynamic in terms of what that collection is, creating that efficiency allows you to be able to absorb that. It allows you to sort of limit the amount of sort of compensation growth and personnel expense that you have in terms of inflationary numbers going forward. So it definitely helps control what your rate increases would look like.
Yeah, just a quick question. I guess adding on to Mayor Pro Tem mentioned, the idea of like when, I guess Neil said this, when you go back to automated, you are going to lose people, right? I mean, staff. They're going to be like those guys that are on the back of the truck. They're out of a job, right? Are we losing?
Well, there's a contract with a temp labor firm that provides a lot of that support, and there was already a great deal of turnover in those positions.
Right.
So in terms of individuals losing their jobs or something they relied on, I think the likelihood of that is pretty low.
Okay, so most of those guys are from a temp agency.
Correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Can I speak on that also?
Sure.
And even if it's just the fact that they're temporary employees, we're still filling a void in the job market, and I don't want to see that go away. And when I hear you say automated, and I know how we felt about automated things years ago, but now I know how we feel about automation as we're walking around Walmart and we can't find humans to do the things that we need done. So I think we really need to consider that. I'll be honest, I'm a proponent for people and hiring people and allowing people to have an opportunity.
I appreciate your comments. I think one of the values of automation is that it expands the pool of folks that can be hired for this work. In fact, it will create some opportunities to create more inclusive job path for the collection process. So, you know, there's some value there. But I certainly appreciate your comments as well.
Help me understand that comment.
So, for example, typically, you know, collecting through a semi-automated process is very hard on the body. So typically you will have, and historically, you will have young men who are engaging in this work, and as they sort of mature into their position, the incidence of workers' compensation claims tends to increase, right? Becomes much more challenging work. When you automate, you make that job much less physically taxing. It's much more available to females. It's much more available to folks who are more mature, who are older in their workforce, right? So it expands that opportunity, that recruiting pool, because as a driver who's managing an automated process, the primary you know, function of that is not physical strength.
I guess the one concern, and I hear what you're saying, I get it. I think the one concern is that that's the one place in city employment where you have people that perhaps have varied backgrounds, that have limited education. You know, it's a job they can do because they, you know, have strength and endurance or whatever, and that they can do that job, whereas they may not be able to move up the employment ladder. I assume that's what Kevin was mentioning, and I get that. I don't know how many people that is, but.
And moving to automation won't change those opportunities for those folks. It won't diminish them.
How's that? You just told me that you're not going to have the guys on the back of the truck. Those are the guys with no education that actually, you know, get a job. I don't know. I mean.
No, Margaret, I wasn't speaking to the education aspect of that. So no, that's not what I was saying. I was saying that with the temporary job pool, what we have is people who may have some troubled backgrounds. I'm not speaking to the educational level. They just may have some barriers to gainful employment, and this allows them to be employed and to earn income for their families and for themselves. Now, I want to see all people be able to move up the ladder, socially, occupationally, or whatever, in any aspect. So no, I'm not speaking to the education piece of that.
Neil?
I understand where this conversation's coming from, but I also have to say, I have to look at it from the taxpayer standpoint here. I mean, we're not here we're here to have good employees and train them and have them if we need them. You know, we're not here just to have employees. I mean, if it's more efficient, saves money, it keeps our tax rate low, makes our housing more affordable. That conversation, and plus we're talking about temporary employees. They don't even work for us. They're here one week, they don't work the next week. I mean, I don't see the allegiance there. I mean, we need to focus on, you know, how do we keep housing inexpensive? How do we keep the tax rate down? And that's what they're bringing it to us for, because if it can save us money long term, that's what it does. All this is circular. If we don't have lower tax rates, we have high home prices, and you can't live there. So I mean, this is what we should be doing. Now, I don't know I haven't seen the bottom line to all this, and you know what that looks like. But I'm sure these trucks are quite expensive. So, but no, I applaud it. I mean, we have to look at it. Now, we have to how we change it is up to us. But
Mr. Anderson, I'm going to address that after they finish and Rick and I come up. But I did want to make a couple of points related to the labor pool. On any given day, back when labor was more plentiful, we would call anywhere from or need anywhere from 10 people up to 25 people per day, every day, to deliver this service.
Temporary.
The availability of this labor pool has diminished greatly, and we don't get that amount of temporary staff on a daily basis anymore. In addition, so it's a challenge. We routinely struggle to get enough people to put on trucks to go out and deliver this service routinely. And it's not just because of the staff we're pulling in from the temporary agency, it's also because of our staff. This job is very, very physical, as Jonathan mentioned. We have a lot of very prideful employees that have been with us a long, long time. Unfortunately, we have to send them out in a truck with only one helper. So the driver is having to get in and out of the truck maybe a couple hundred times a day. And if he's been with us for 20 years, that's a lot of wear and tear on the body. So that's what's, also I just want to make sure that that is a point that y'all keep in mind as we go through this discussion that's important.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that helps explain what's going on when we're eventually going to get to the cost-benefit analysis here on
Yes, ma'am.
this whole thing.
So I think Johnson's got just one more slide to go, and then Rick and I will come up.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
So as we mentioned, we've touched on this. You know, we used Greenville as a comparison. Pretty significant gains, efficiency gains on the automation side. There is also some opportunity to maybe increase capacity. The automated loaders can typically carry more waste than semi-automated, so it's possible you will realize some savings there. We don't necessarily want to bank on that, partly because there are also weight limits on the highway in terms of the trip out to the dump that you have to pay attention to. But there's maybe some potential opportunities for savings, improved efficiency, and some positive environmental impact as well. So in terms of just key conclusions, I want to hit just a few points. One, you know, we see there really being an opportunity to move forward with automation. It can provide a lot of value in terms of the efficiency of service, in terms of broadening your recruitment pool. There are some collection day changes required. You know, we've worked with a lot of communities who have done this in the past, and you know, there's an initial adjustment, but with really focused public education, it's pretty quickly absorbed by the community in terms of what those collection day changes are. And you know, it doesn't take long with good education to realize, okay, I set out on Thursday instead of Tuesday now, right? So you know, so we see that as being very manageable. Being able to limit that use of temporary pool, again as Dave mentioned, the difficulty in terms of that recruitment really adds some value, broadens your opportunities, and creates really some opportunity and some safety improvement for your employees, for your current employees. So you know, that employee injuries and workers' comp claims, that compensation burden over time that I mentioned, sort of the trajectory of your cost maybe flattening a little bit. And then, of course, that more expanded and inclusive recruiting pool. So, you know, we see real value in it. We see opportunity. We see that once it's implemented, there'll be additional gains into the future that you can realize. And there's a real opportunity to also use this to absorb some of the community growth without necessarily adding a huge pool of additional resources or adding routes. Okay. So with that, if there are any other questions for us, happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Mr. Mays and Mr. Porter.
You good? Great, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Good morning again. So between myself and Rick Porter, we're going to talk to you about an opportunity for this modernization of our trash delivery service. As we get into the conversation, one point I wanted to make is this is an opportunity for us to build some operational capacity. And what I mean by that is if we become more efficient in how we are able to collect, we can use that efficiency to help deal with the pressures that are put on the routes that we have. The semi-automated trucks will max out between 850 and 900 stops a day. The automated trucks over 1,000. So one route can absorb some of the infill development that we're experiencing. Think about Echo Farms right now. It's undergoing a lot of development. We can't just necessarily add that on to an existing route without feasibly not being able to get that route done. So that's a consideration. These trucks are our primary tool, right? They're extremely important for us to be able to get the job done. This current fiscal year, this is why we're bringing this to you, this current fiscal year, we have 9 trucks that are up for replacement right now. So we've worked with Raftellus to get to this point so we could come to you with this opportunity. And the other point that's important to consider is that these trucks aren't just sitting on a lot waiting for somebody to come up and buy them. Typically, you place the order, and it could be as much as 12 months before they arrive here on site. Last year, we placed an order for 13 replacement trucks of the semi-automated packers, the regular trucks. And we've only received 2 of them so far. So they don't come in very quickly, which is why it's important for this conversation. So I'll turn it over to Rick. He'll talk you through our current method and the ASL.
Good morning, Council. So we've talked about some of this stuff already, but I'm just going to go through so I don't get out of whack here. But we currently use what are known as semi-automated rear-load trucks. They use a tipper in the back that a driver operates the truck while 2 workers bring the carts and return them to both sides of a residential street. This allows in many areas that the trucks can do a single pass down the road and collect both sides of the street. This is a picture of a rear load truck. A couple of our guys working out in one of our recent storms. These trucks can achieve up to about 900 collection stops in a 10-hour shift. And as you see, it does expose our employees to road hazards, animals, and adverse weather conditions. So modernizing city trash collection would involve changing to fully automated side-loading trucks, which are also known as ASLs. This equipment uses a joystick-controlled arm and gripper, which grabs, empties, and returns the cart, all from inside the cab. A single operator performs all the functions and generally does not need to exit the vehicle. The arm is only on the curb side of the truck, and therefore ASLs have to make 2 passes down the street. ASLs are equipped with many modern safety features. They have high visibility cabs. They're operated from the right-hand side of the cab, which allows the driver to have very good visibility as he's servicing the carts. The cameras show all the sides of the vehicle, and there's a camera that aids in aligning the arm with the cart for collection. There's also a camera inside the hopper, which allows the driver to detect any prohibited or hazardous materials that might have been in the customer's cart. The driver can then stop the operation before the material might be packed into the back of the truck. As you'll see, there's a ladder next to the hopper so that they could climb up and remove any potential hazardous material. So automated collection allows about 1,000 stops in a 10-hour shift. As Kevin stated, it can go up as operational improvement goes. ASLs will reduce RTS staff exposure to many hazards, including traffic, pulls and strains, heat, cold, and other weather conditions. I have a short video here that'll show. Hopefully.
It's a pretty good test for the tank.
Okay, so in summary, modernization with automated collection can help build capacity for customer growth without the need for additional vehicles and staff. It can reduce our reliance on the temporary labor. It'll greatly reduce the physical requirements and minimize the exposure to hazards and injury. And Mr. Mays will now present some possible steps forward. Any questions for me?
So to proceed with a modernization plan, what steps are needed in order, in between the time we potentially order this type of truck and the time that we actually start automated collection? There are 5 bullets up there that are really our areas of focus that will require us to work on in between whenever the trucks are ordered and whenever they start collecting. Number 1 is personnel. We're going to have to obviously train our staff as well as the fleet staff. This is a new truck. There's going to be different components, so they'll need some training on us to how to operate it and the fleet staff how to maintain it. Secondly, safety protocols. It's a different operation. We're going to have to put some protocols in place to make sure we're operating safely, we're minimizing damage to private property and minimizing those risks. Code update. This is really related to how we want customers to place the carts. We don't want them to put them behind cars. We want them to make them accessible, whether it's on the street or actually on the driveway apron, as you saw in the video. We'd want to make sure that's part of the code. Number 4, public outreach. This is probably going to be the biggest part, right? Because it's going to require day changes. That's important. And it's also going to require education about how to place the cart. And lastly, we got to optimize the routes. We got to create the routes, right? It's a different answer. If we go with the semi-automated method, it's a different answer that we give to Raftellus, because those routes are not the same. And we'll need to give them direction in order to finalize their last step. So, in terms of the cost of service delivery, here's a comparison. First, you should know that we currently have a very healthy fund balance in RTS. We're right at 53.8% of unassigned fund balance in the 58.3% of the operating budget. Policy requires 15 to 20% for an enterprise fund. Going with the current semi-automated method, those trucks are right now right around $235,000 per truck. Multiplying that by 9 and pulling out of fund balance what we would need in order to buy those trucks, we would reduce fund balance to about 37.2%, and that would result in an overall impact of 3.19% to the cost of service delivery. Choosing the modernized automation method, those trucks are more expensive. They are right now about $360,000 per vehicle. Multiplying that by 9 and pulling out what we need from fund balance, that reduces fund balance down to about 25.8%. That results in an overall impact of 2.91% in terms of cost of service delivery. This is recognizing the fact that we would estimate about a $240,000 per year savings in the budget that we've set aside for the temporary labor pool. Yes, sir.
The 3.19 and 2.91 impact, what is that impact? Impact to the ratepayer?
It's an impact to how much it's going to cost us to deliver the service. Yes, sir.
Gotcha. All right.
Neil?
Is the 240 over and above, or is part of the 2.91?
That's factored into the 2.91.
So it saves less money.
It's a better
Well, 3.19 is a greater savings than 2.91. reading this wrong?
No, so the impact would be a positive impact. So 3.19% over and above what we're having to pay now, versus for modernizing, it would only be 2.91%. So it's a slight reduction in how much it costs.
Okay. How do we get to 54%? I mean, maybe that's a conversation for another day, but is that typical to have fund balance that high? It begs the question, if our rates are high, is that just?
So uniquely about the trucks that
Well,
we
I'm
need.
talking about our 54% unassigned fund balance.
I understand. I've
Yeah.
got an answer.
Okay.
I'm going through the trucks to get there. So, the trucks that we're being, that are up for replacement right now were part of a financing arrangement that was done back in 2013 or 14, that was exterior to the traditional fleet fund method of replacing vehicles. These trucks, as a result, don't have a significant amount of money in the fleet fund for replacement. We've been able to take that money and put it into fund balance, which makes us able to have a healthy fund balance so that we can have this one-time expense. So I would say
Are we changing how that's doing? Have we been changing that since? Or are we going to continue? In other words, we're not putting in a fund to, okay, this is to replace the trucks.
The numbers
We're just
that
going to keep doing it this way with fund balance.
No, sir. No, sir. The numbers that are presented to you, the percentages incorporate us paying into the fleet fund every single year for the future replacement of those trucks. So no, the answer is.
The fund balance, if it gets reduced to whatever, 37, 25%, it's not likely to just go flying back up because you're now funneling most of that money into fleet replacement.
Correct. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, and maybe I misunderstood, so help me, but if you've ordered 14 trucks or whatever it was, 13 trucks, you've gotten 2 of them, you still want the old truck? Or can you cancel them and buy these new trucks? Or
So
we're going to have both?
We operate, there's 27 trucks in our fleet. Those 13 trucks were in last year's replacement. So no,
they're coming.
They're coming.
Okay.
These are 9 more that are at the end of their life cycle.
Okay, great, thank you.
So should we choose to go with the modernized plan, here's a proposed project timeline, very, very dependent on the delivery of the trucks, obviously. Using January as a starting point, we allocate the funding, get the trucks purchased. Again, it's a possible 12-month lead time on when the trucks might arrive. In March of 2023, we would get the routes finalized for the modernized collection process. That would include the customer day changes. In September of 2023, we would start phase 1 of public outreach campaign. This would be in about 6 months before collection starts, and that's really going to focus on where to put your cart and where not to put your cart. December 2023, trucks would be delivered. Phase 2 of customer outreach would begin, and this would really focus on the collection day changes. We don't want to start that too early for confusing purposes. Between January and February, we're going to get our operators trained and our fleet staff trained, and in March of 2024, we'd commence automated collection. Now, all of that shifts depending on delivery of the trucks, anticipated delivery of the trucks. So lastly, I just wanted to revisit capacity building. It's important as the city continues to grow inward that we have the ability to be able to absorb those additional customers. These ASLs allow us to do that a lot easier without having to add a whole nother crew and a whole nother truck. Modernization also helps us adapt to a changing labor market. Again, these trucks are operated with one person, and in some cases, there was a picture that was shown before This is myself and Rick standing up in Cary talking to some staff up there. The gentleman that we were talking to was the operator of one of those trucks. And his statement to us was that if that truck wasn't available for him to operate, he would not want to be a trash collector. So it gives us the opportunity to try and recruit from a different type of person that may want to do it, but they don't want to do it without that type of truck. Very important point here is that this is a major improvement to the safety of our city employees. Stepping off the back of a trash truck 400 times a day, risk of knee and ankle injuries or back injuries, and it's also, lastly, going to expand and diversify our talent pool. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Burnett?
Do we have backup truck drivers?
So not only do we have backup trucks, we do have capacity within our existing staff. We have more operators than we have routes that are run on any given day. And if you think about it, we need that simply because people go on vacation, they get sick, they get hurt, and that is as equally a challenging situation, as I mentioned before, with the temporary labor pool. That can be equally as challenging. We got to have enough people to drive the trucks on any given day, and that's a routine thing that we deal with. But yes, sir, we have more operators than routes.
Okay, good.
Neil, Mr. Anderson?
So, without going back through all the slides, and I'll miss the number a little bit, but the savings is only really kind of that you can just plug in a calculator is about 1%. It's all the qualitative stuff about being able to absorb the growth in the city and the expansion and the risk of of these injuries, and it's all the things you just listed there. It's not so much the instant dollar change like you might see in some automations. It's all about this other stuff that's more long-term and more unpredictable.
That's an excellent point, and as an example, that Echo Farms and River Lights area is becoming very, very challenging to be able to get done based on our current routes, to the point that it wouldn't be that long necessarily before we needed to come back with an additional truck and an additional full-time staff people in order to be able to serve the way we're doing it. Using ASLs allows us to absorb that growth without having to ask for an additional truck. Now, the truck is more expensive, but as I stated, we're gonna put these trucks back into the more traditional method of funding them on an annual basis.
Just trying to make sure I got the whole concept. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer to me. You got the funds to purchase 9 trucks in the budget or in your reserve fund now. We've got more. We're increasing efficiency in our service to the taxpayer, and ultimately, it's going to be less expensive to the taxpayer and leverage the growth that we're going to continue to see. I don't see a downside whatsoever. So I appreciate the presentation and the education.
Great. Thank you.
Madam Mayor Pro Tem, I
Yes.
just want to remind council, because I don't want you to go into this blind. There's an old adage in local government, there's 2 things you don't mess with. One is house numbers and the other is correct collection days. There will be some behavior modification that will be necessary associated with this. I think this is a great idea. I think it's the way we need to go. But please understand, there will be some behavior modification that will be employed, and we'll have to make some points with some folks to be able to get that done.
Which, the interpretation of that is there'll be a lot of complaints initially from people getting used to it.
Yes, ma'am. But it only takes once of your garbage not getting picked up to make you learn, believe me.
Right.
Great, thank you.
And the complaints, I mean, that's not going to change it. I mean, it's just that people may not like. My pickup is on Thursdays, but they change it to Monday. So I mean, but like you say, once they realize, oops, they're coming on Monday, they'll adjust.
Yes, sir.
I like the idea too. I think it's a good, I mean, we need to do that. I watched some guys the other day get off the truck back and forth. And, you know, I watched them at DC Virgo, and they jumped down off the truck like about 5 times. While, I mean, like 5 minutes, I'm going, man, that would kill my knees. You know, so you're right. I think it's what we have to do. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor Pro Tem, that's all we have this morning, except for the fact we are going to request a closed session.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there a motion to enter into a closed session pursuant to the provisions of GS 143-318, period 11, A3 and A5 in order for City Council to: Number 1, instruct staff regarding the city's negotiating position concerning the possible acquisition of real property. And number 2, consult with and provide instruction to the city attorney regarding potential legal claims, including the case of the Funkyard LLC versus the City of Wilmington, file number 21CVS2790. Is there a motion?
I'm off that motion.
So there's a motion by Mr. Barnett and a second by Mr. Waddell. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Oh, I have to do the roll call. Thank you. Well, let's see who's here. Mr. Anderson, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mr. Barnett?
Aye.
Mr. Spears?
Aye.
Mr. Waddell?
Aye.
And I vote aye. The motion passes. Let me also note that the closed session will be held in the city attorney's conference room, and at the end of the closed session, council will reopen its public session and adjourn from the location without returning to the council chamber. And at this time, we will move into closed session.